We have some experts that are going to spend some time talking about big data, what's happening in the space, why is it important for us as leaders to understand it and understand the technology behind it, et cetera. And I have the distinction of introducing Jerry Long, who is one of our archons at Beta Iota Boulé, and is the owner of a business called PCC. I keep saying it, PCC Technology Group. I can't get it out of my head, but he wants to shorten it to PCC. He told me that. So Jerry is going to kind of kick off the panel, introduce your panelists, and we'll get right into the subject. So Jerry, take it away.
Thank you, Greg. We as a company, PCC Technology Group, and I'll go back to what Greg just said, we're proud to be a sponsor of this summer executive workshop. And we're particularly proud to sponsor and participate in this big data discussion, and I hope we'll have a good interactive meeting here, where we'll learn about the intricacies of big data and the exponential growth of it. And what do we do with this data? How is it archived? How do we get it? What do we do with it? All those kinds of things. For us at PCC, the real issue is not that large amounts of data being acquired, but the problem is, what are you going to do with the data once you get it, and is the data really good? I was just telling Michael and Nnamdi, my business is we are a software products company now that you guys have probably used our products. If you live in one of 21 states, you may have used our voter registration software system. And we've developed that system, and it's implemented in 15 states, but in another additional 9 states, we have implemented campaign finance reporting systems. So anybody who's running for political office that needs to report your campaign finances, you've probably done that through our system if you are one of those 24 states. So we are the architects, I guess you will, about records for about 80 million people. Now we have voting records for about 80 million people. That's a lot of data. Now it's not our data, but it's the state's data, and they are now beginning to try to figure out what are they going to do with that data? How can they predict what you as a voter are going to do? Now we're not Big Brother looking at you, but they do have that capability, and it will be shortly, they will kind of figure it out. The vision is that organizations will be able to take the data from any source, harvest it, and figure out how to find answers that enable us to reduce costs, reduce time spent on efforts in a new product development, and just trying to make smarter business decisions. I'm sure we'll learn that from these two fine gentlemen today. And I'm pleased to introduce Michael Bennett and Nnamdi Okike. Did I get it? Who are going to talk to us about big data today. So I'm going to start it off by asking the question of these two gentlemen, how do you define big data and what are some of its components? And I'll start with you, Michael.
Okay. First, many of you know me, but I'll do a little personal introduction. One is I'm the former CIO of BAE Systems. Former, that's not what the program says, former as of a couple of weeks, so I just got out of jail. So I'm thankful. And where I'm focused on now, even though I'm kind of in a bit of a pause, is I'm thankful to have been nominated for the board of directors of the Postal Service Board of Governors. And so just got through a Senate confirmation hearing and waiting on the final vote of the Senate, hopefully by the 1st of September. And also doing some consulting, which will really relate to this whole question around big data with several small companies that have got great products that are utilizing data analytics, which is really what big data is about. It's about taking the data. For the most part, all this data that exists out there is junk until you start to do the analytics. What's really important is how do you take that information that is out there, and the reason that people call it big data is that there's so much of it, particularly now that storage is so plentiful and so cheap, and the cloud, which is really nothing but other people's servers. That the cloud is out there and there's so much information out there. So the issue is around how do you manage, how do you use analytics to give you good information or good output of information particularly from a business perspective, to drive efficiency in and cost out of business processes. And I mean, at the core of it, that's what big data is really all about. So I'll stop there and pass this on to Nnamdi.
Appreciate that, Michael. I'm Nnamdi Okike. I'm the founder and managing partner of 645 Ventures. We're a seed stage venture capital fund. So we invest in software and internet companies. Big data is a big part of our investment strategy. I've spent about 10 years in the venture business. Previously worked for a fund called Insight Venture Partners, which is a $7 billion fund in New York. I think Michael made a bunch of great points about big data. I think the first thing with big data is the proliferation of data and the quantity of data that's out there. A couple of statistics that I was reading up on. 90% of the world's data from the beginning of time was created in the last 2 years. It's an amazing stat. 90% of all the data created was created in the last 2 years, according to IBM. So the pace of data creation is astounding. Today, there's about 2.5 billion gigabytes of data created daily. And all this data needs to be stored, it needs to be categorized, it needs to be searched. And it's got major implications for enterprises in terms of how they run their businesses, both from a security point of view, from a business operations point of view, from an expense management point of view, as well as for individuals. Everybody here, I assume, may use social networks, you may use LinkedIn, you may use Twitter. All that data is stored. It's stored in different places. We can get into where it's stored and how it's stored. But for individuals, how that data is managed and where it goes and who has access to it is very important. And how it's secured is another major issue. So we can talk about all those things. So it's a topic that's become really important. And big data is not new. I think the management and analysis of it is not a new thing. It's the quantity of data and the pace of it and all the different forms that it's being created in. So I think with that, maybe we can.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. You can see that we have a panel of experts here, and what I want to do is I want to have a, sort of an interactive kind of session with you folks, so that if there's any question in the audience, I may just ask a question, and then I'll give these gentlemen the mic, and they will answer the question, but then all of a sudden, I may ask, is there a question in the audience? Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Michael, you had talked a little bit about the security of the data and how one of those components is how do you secure the big data. And Nnamdi, you had just made the comment that all of the 90% of the data has just been created in the last 2 years. Now, if all the data has been created, 90% of the data has been created in the last 2 years, how do we secure that?
I think there are a couple of things one needs to consider. First of all data doesn't need to be secured. You know, I mean, one of the things that I ran our cybersecurity business at BAE several years ago prior to my most recent former job. Where's Shelley? Shelley's got a lot of former jobs. He didn't even hear me. I'll tell you later. Did you wake up, Shelley? Or what? Woke him up. But all the data that we have really doesn't need to be secured. I mean, I used to use the adage in the company, I really could care less whether somebody had a copy of my calendar. I didn't care if anybody knew where where my meetings were or where I was going, unless I was working on an acquisition somewhere and it had to be private. But for the most part, 99% of the information that I have, I could care less whether other people see it. And so why should we spend a boatload of money trying to secure all this information that I have or that is on me that I could care less whether other people saw. And so some of this is not a technology issue with regard to big data. Some of it is to create a culture inside of a company where people identify the information that are crown jewels. I'll talk about DuPont for a second and beat on Shelley a little bit. I happen to have had I'm trying to keep you awake, Shelley. I happen to have, I mean, Shelley's chief information security officer is probably the Fong, I think, is probably the leading expert in the country, if not the world, relative to security. And DuPont's is on a journey to drive a culture in their organization to where people start to identify that information that are your crown jewels. In the DuPont paint business, I just happen to know this because I talked to Fawn a couple of months ago. In the DuPont paint business, the formula for white paint is the real key to their entire paint business. If somebody got the formula for white paint out of DuPont, they could in essence destroy or cannibalize DuPont's paint business. And so now that's obviously a crown jewel. And so there has to be some activity beyond the technology inside of a company to start to focus on what are my crown jewels and how do I protect the crown jewels. And let's not invest money on protecting things that really aren't all that important. From a cybersecurity perspective, you cannot keep people out of your networks. I mean, you do the very best that you can, but you are going to be hacked. I mean, it's just not, there's smart people coming up with new stuff every day. So why not invest around protecting those things that are crown jewels to your organization versus trying to protect everything?
That's a good point, Michael. I think you make a couple good points there. Not all the data needs to be secured. And so one of the questions is, how do you determine what needs to be secured and what doesn't? And how do you create compliance rules to make sure that the stuff that is the crown jewels, as you mentioned, is secured? I think one of the issues that has changed the way people think about storage is the rise of software as a service and cloud storage, which I assume a lot of people have heard about. That's a new innovation that's really transpired over the last 10 years. And what that really has done is big companies used to store a lot of the data within their own data centers, which are big facilities with a lot of servers, which some of you guys may have seen. Today, increasingly now, companies store their data via cloud hosting, via things like Amazon Web Services, via external data center providers. And so what that means is, today, a lot of the data is not secured on premise. It's secured by somebody else. So the question is, what are they doing with it? How are they managing it? Can you create policies around that management? And there are benefits and disadvantages to that. One of the big benefits is the idea that instead of, as an enterprise, having to run this all in-house and spend the money on the servers and the storage, a third party can do it. So you can scale up and scale down based upon your needs. On the other hand, it creates the possibility that, as you mentioned, some of these entities can be hacked and can be infiltrated, and you have to think about how that happens. So I think you make a couple of good points. One is, how do you make sure you understand what the data that actually needs to be secured is, and then how do you create compliance rules around that? And if you're using third-party entities, how do you make sure that they have the right rules in place?
Thank you. Do we have any questions in the audience? Right here. I'll bring you the mic.
I agree with you in general that there's a lot of information that probably doesn't need to be secured, but I'm wondering what your response is to those who would say that the aggregate of information which individually doesn't need to be secured can lead one, whether it's somebody who's engaged in corporate espionage or whatever the case is, can lead one to understand and to develop enough, through all of the different microdata, get enough information to figure out the things that you really don't want them to figure out. What is your response to that?
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, I don't think I need it, but I think that's a really good point, and I think that's one where, from a data protection perspective, you really have to drive a culture where people start to think through and understand those kind of things. Also, too, there are a lot of companies out there that have pretty unique technologies that will allow, when people do get into your networks and get into your systems, that will allow certain data to go out for purposes of confusion. And so that kind of technique is something that one can use. But I think also, too, you really have to at least drive some cultural thought process into your business relative to really making sure that you protect those crown jewels. And I get your point, because sometimes you do aggregate things and come up with good answers. But more times than not, when people aggregate things, they come up with bad answers. So you got to be careful about that too.
Yeah, you make a couple of good points, and I didn't realize Jerry runs a voting records company. You may know how I voted the last couple of years, which, in any case, So I think there's a couple of points there. I think the first is, as an individual, I think you want to be knowledgeable about what information you're putting out there on the web. So if you're using social networks, if you're doing e-commerce, likely there's information out there. So understanding who those providers are, what they're doing with it, what their terms of use are, all those start to read the whole thing. Understanding what those companies are doing with the data is important. Also being smart about what you put out there. Making sure that you're not putting everything out there to a provider who you don't know who they are. So first of all, it's the individual. Then it's also the company. I think the onus is on the companies to make sure that they're managing the data in the right way. I'm an investor today in 3 big data companies. I bring up one that's relevant. It's a company called Poshly, which does data and analytics for the beauty industry. So they basically have software tools they use to analyze consumer demand. And consumers will answer surveys in exchange for product giveaways. And that data is used by beauty companies to analyze how to market, where to position their products, how to price them. And so Poshly has basically a data privacy compliance framework. And so all of their data is anonymized. It's never traceable to the individual. They make sure that the data is stored in a good way, in accordance with their compliance rules, and they make sure that their customers know that. So I think it's both the individual as well as the company, and it's a two-way street, I would say.
I saw a question over here.
Yes, well, my
Right here.
first question was along the lines of what has already been asked. I'll go to the second question. It's kind of a 2-tier strategy where you perhaps keep the crown jewels in-house, push everything else to the third-party cloud. Is that a more viable way of maintaining security? So cost-effective, but still.
Yeah. That's what I would always recommend that a company does. I mean, focus on your own crown jewels. Invest in. There's lots of products out there that can help you secure your own data, but invest in securing the data that's really important to you. And then there are also security measures built into other servers, whether it's a multi-tenant or a private cloud, to protect that information. But if it's a crown jewel, I would recommend, or have recommended people keep that in-house and invest and focus on that. It's a lot easier to protect the information if you know where it all is. But again, part of it is driving a culture, I guess, inside of an organization where people are thinking about, is this something that I really want to protect, and make sure that it actually goes there. The other thing is you've got to move to, I think, I would recommend that companies move to an environment where you're not keeping data on individual items. So it's not sitting on your laptop, it's not sitting on your phone or your iPad, that you are really working virtually inside of a data center versus working off of your particular item, or particularly because at that point, then you've got to protect your laptop, your iPhone, your iPad, all this kind of stuff. And the technology is there so that you can actually work off of a server versus working off of an item, particularly when it comes to sensitive data that you want to have protected. And there are different methods for identification so that only certain people can get to certain information that sits inside of either a cloud, a multi-tenant or a private cloud, or your own internal data center. So that's maybe more specific than you cared about, but.
I think you covered a lot.
Greg?
No, I'm good. Actually, I have a 2-part question. The first builds on something that Nat showed earlier. I'm not sure if you were here, but there was the video with Anonymous, so threatening the Ferguson Police Department. So if you were CIO for that organization, I mean, what could one do about that type of threat? And then my second question is for startup companies, smaller companies that have access to a lot of data on their clients. I mean, what are they doing if they don't have the capability to build a big infrastructure in-house? How are they protecting customer data or other critical data that's of value to their franchise?
Yeah, I guess I'd touch on the second one first. A lot of startup companies, particularly technology companies, are using Amazon Web Services or similar cloud hosting providers. And Amazon Web Services has different tiers of storage and processing, but they do have certain security rules and also availability rules. And Amazon Web Services, to my knowledge, so far has been pretty good. I don't recall major attacks or major compromises of data. And Amazon actually created web services to run their own infrastructure. And Amazon manages a tremendous amount of customer information. So they basically took what they used in-house and basically said we can sell it as a service. So a lot of startups use Amazon Web Services or similar types of solutions, and so far they've been pretty good. But again, I think you want to make sure you monitor and track what those companies do and understand their policies, and if there are issues, you're proactive about them. I think to your first question about anonymous, those things are difficult. I think you have a constant battle between hackers that are trying to compromise sites or trying to knock down sites or do things like denial of service attacks, and security companies that are trying to prevent those. I think at the end of the day, you want to use good software, so you can use things like intrusion prevention software, denial of service attack prevention software. There are a lot of solutions out there, but nothing's ever perfect. It's kind of a war of attrition, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I'll address the first question about anonymous first, and that is, I think, and I didn't disagree or don't disagree with what Ann Fudd said earlier in the keynote relative to online your image, and she tried to stay away from certain things, stay away from Facebook and those kind of things. I really think that whether you like it or not, and it's getting progressively more and more, your brand, your image is what's online. And I think that you have to actively manage that. And not just from the standpoint of messages, but you have to actively manage the technology that is used in LinkedIn and Facebook to make sure that your message, your image, that you actively figure out, what it is, and make sure that the message that, or the image that you want is out there, because people do look and they spend time looking at where you are. I remember, and my wife will verify this, we were up when I decided I was leaving BAE, not decided, but when I left BAE a few weeks ago. I decided a long time ago, but when I left BAE a few weeks ago officially, I said, gosh, I better change my LinkedIn and my Facebook messages. And it was, 11:30, 12 o'clock at night that we were going through and making sure I had the right, where I work now, or that I don't work, or, those kind of things. And probably within 15 minutes, I had 48 viewers. And this was at midnight, close to midnight. I had 48 viewers look and see who I was now. And so whether you like it or not, people are online, and your image is there, and your brand is there, and you better actively manage it. And that goes for an individual, and that goes for a police department. The Ferguson Police Department's image is online. It's on TV, it's on that, and they better actively manage that. And the only way they're going to be able to combat something like anonymous is if they are actively managing the image that they have and the information that actually goes out there.
So, the great philosopher Mike Tyson says, everyone has a plan until they get hit. So you get hit. Until you get hit. Okay. So, when one gets hit, how does one repurpose, reboot, replant themselves once that compromise has occurred from a personal branding standpoint?
I don't know if that was a suggestion. That's a tough one. You're talking about personal reputation? Well, we can talk about a couple of different things. If you're talking about individuals, things live on the internet for a long time. So part of it is if you're an individual and things are inaccurate, if something gets out there and it's not accurate, resolving that. It could be in the form of a public statement. It could be in the form of if you have a blog. It could be, who knows? But if there's something that's inaccurate that's out there about you, being proactive to manage that and explain. And you see it also with companies oftentimes. If there's something an employee does that they shouldn't be doing, or there's some issue with customer data. A lot of companies, I think the best method is to be proactive and to admit what's happened, and then to address the issue and talk about how you're solving it. I think it applies both to companies and individuals. I think the unfortunate thing is, as opposed to the offline world, it's hard to get data off the internet once it's out there. It can live for a very long time. But maybe you have some points on that.
No.
That's a difficult question.
Yeah, I mean, for example, Target, everyone knows, I mean, that's public.
Right.
You, the chief person, IT person at Target, what would you have done differently in their situation?
In terms of when they got hacked and all the people credit cards were stolen and that kind of stuff. I mean, the biggest thing that you have to do, there are two, once you have that kind of hack occur, one of two things you should do and one of two things you shouldn't do, and they're the same thing. One is, in some circumstances where you want to advertise it very, very quickly so that people know and they can make some changes internally, or you don't want anybody to know, so you have an opportunity to catch the perpetrator. If there's an interest, if your primary focus is in catching the perpetrator, then you keep that as quiet as you can for as long as possible to try and find them. Because there are methods of finding the perpetrator. If, in Target's case, I think the biggest risk was with the customers and the consumers versus finding the perpetrator. You need to let people know quickly so that they can do what they need to do to protect their own personal interests. If in a case like, if you're with a defense company, like I used to be with, and somebody comes after sensitive defense information, you really want to figure out who's trying to get it. And so you don't advertise that right away. In general, that's been my experience. But you actually try to find where that the source is. But in a big consumer environment, you better let everybody know very, very quickly so they have an opportunity to check. Because the biggest thing in those environments, and the best thing to do that you can do quickly, is simply change your passwords on some accounts, or to simply change your account or close some accounts down before, or at minimum, check to see whether or not somebody has been spending your money. So those are, so it's really one of two things. You either put it out there quickly, or you keep it quiet, but depending on the circumstances that you're looking at.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Ron, in response to your question about the personal attack, you called Judy Smith. Just the Target thing triggered. I was going to ask this question because for my company, Korn Ferry, as well as a lot of our clients, the hacking attempts are relentless. There was 1,000 attempts in like a 10-day period, for example. And most of these hackers are international institutions or states as opposed to individuals. So from a big data perspective, there are these two threats that are occupying the mindset of most of the CEOs we talk to now. They have big data, how to protect, and it's more risky when third-party storage is part of the equation because those organizations change so frequently. In terms of, and you're one send away from your valuation really literally being significantly impacted, like Target has demonstrated. So how to think about, what's the simple way of thinking about how to protect yourself off, given the evolution of the sophistication of the attackers, while also protecting yourself from internal people too? Because this is, there's, and Edward Snowden is an example where there are people who have access to data too who can use it against you. And so there's this increased vulnerability at the board level with, we're on all this dynamite that we really don't know, and we're hoping that people do the right thing. Is it just a perpetual invest every 3 weeks and updating all the time is the answer? Those are the things that are keeping people up at night when they have a report.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think there are different aspects, and I don't think you're ever going to be perfect. I think you just want to be a step ahead. So the first is, what is the quality of the software that you're using? There are intrusion detection, intrusion prevention systems, and that's a constantly evolving field. So you want to use a best-of-breed software provider. If you're talking about internal, there are companies that provide, for example, mobile device management software. My last firm, Inside Ventures, was an investor in a company called AirWatch, which basically has software to manage employee devices. So if employees are bringing in their own phones into the enterprise, making sure that the applications that are on those phones are known. If they're leaving, making sure that the data that they're stored on those phones is wiped. So there are tools that enable companies to both manage the internal and the external. That's a part of it. I think it's also your security team. I'm sure you guys at Korn Ferry have a strong, I don't know what your security team looks like, but I'm sure you have a chief security officer, a team of individuals, data scientists who are looking at the nature of the hacks. So having a good team that's knowledgeable and experienced, I think, is important as well. So it's continually being vigilant. And I think to the point you made, if there is a breach, being proactive and understanding what that is, and if you're a consumer-facing company, making sure that consumers understand what happened. I think one of the issues with Target is I think a lot of people didn't understand what the information that actually was compromised, how much it was. I remember my mom saying, "Oh, I'm not going to shop at Target again." I said, "I don't even know if it's your information, but okay." But I think a lot of individuals, when the information gets out there, just don't know exactly what happened, and there's a fear there. So if there is an issue, being proactive, I think, is a good strategy.
Yeah, I think that this may be too specific, but one of the things I think that every company ought to do is to drive towards virtual computing as much as possible. Get the data off of the individual devices. I mean, that's number one. You'll never get there completely, but you want to try and drive towards virtual computing as much as possible, because what that does is that requires that you have an identification process to actually get to the data, because you're computing out of the data center or out of the server versus computing on your device itself. That's number one. I think number two is, when you have a lot, and I would imagine in your business you have a lot of personal information, you want to try and think through, how can we divide this data up that would force somebody to do an aggregate. I think the young lady back here mentioned, how do you, when somebody is able to get a bunch of different pieces and put it together. That's hard. That's number one. So if you can divide it up and force people to aggregate data, that's another good thing to do, if you can kind of drive that into your processes. So I mean, some of this, and I agree that you've got to have good security systems, particularly when you start looking at moving things to the cloud. You're looking at, their private clouds. Basically, your service that somebody else runs for you, and you can put a certain level of security on that. And then multi-tenant clouds, where you've got servers where a lot of different customers are using those same servers, and the security, while it's good, is not as good as if it's a private cloud. So you ought to think about, when you start going to a cloud, whether or not you want to, whether or not it's okay to be in a multi-tenant cloud, or you really need a private cloud. And those are the questions that I think managers and leaders of a company need to understand, to make sure that they ask those questions of their CIO or of their chief information security officer, relative to how they manage that particular data. There's got to be a lot more engagement in IT infrastructure in general by leadership in a company than there currently is. There's one company that I know that does it incredibly well, and that's because they forced, and that's Cisco. John Chambers forced all of his business leaders to tell him how IT was actually driving their business. Now, they're in the IT business, but believe it or not, even their business leaders were not as engaged relative to how they IT drove their business as they were after John Chambers drove that exercise. So their business leaders went from spending maybe 4 or 5% of their time focused on the IT and the information technology that drove their business, to about 25% of their time. And because they're the ones that really have to ask the right questions.
You mentioned something, and Michelle, I'll come back to you in a minute. You guys mentioned something about the cloud and all of this. Well, what is that all about?
Very broad question. So the cloud, I think.
Probably seen it on my film when you mentioned we were cloud.
So really, I think distilled down, the cloud really is the remote storage of data by third-party providers. When you think about cloud storage, for example, what Amazon Web Services does, really what they do is they store data in their physical facilities. So historically, whereas if you were a company, you may have had your own data center, your own servers that you owned. Today, increasingly, companies use cloud providers, and that could be cloud storage. It also could be software as a service, which is software that, so to speak, runs in the cloud. So who here has used Salesforce.com? Is probably the best example of it. Okay, Salesforce. That's a CRM software, managing customer relationship management. They run their software, as opposed to you installing something on your premise. Salesforce.com runs it on your behalf. You access it via the web, you log in, you enter your information, but they're running it, they're storing it. There are benefits of cloud providers. I think the primary one is that you can scale up based upon your needs as a company. So as opposed to having to invest in these systems that you install on premise, typically they're expensive, you have to have a dedicated IT team to do it. These cloud providers do it on your behalf and kind of take that pain out of managing and also enable you to grow in time. So if you're a small company, you may buy a couple seats of a SaaS vendor. Over time, you may expand. So really, at the end of the day, cloud is really dealing with where the information is stored and how it's stored. And you have companies that are very large businesses that today store a tremendous amount of data. And we can get into what those are. But that's really what cloud is. It's nothing really mysterious per se. It's just, I think when people think of cloud, they think of information somewhere where they can't see it and it's sitting out there. But it's really just the nature of how it's stored and where it's stored.
When you look at the rate at which data is being generated, you gave a number early per day, and it's probably only going to accelerate in time. Do you see that the infrastructure, the computing infrastructure, in particular the algorithms as well, is it going to keep pace, or are we approaching a point where one kind of gets overtaken by the amount of data that's being generated, and there's no real
I'm fairly bullish.
quantum
Yeah,
computing or something?
sure. I'm fairly bullish actually on software companies that are creating software to manage big data. I mean, a big part of our investment thesis is investing in big data companies, and I can talk about some of the ones we've invested in. But there's tremendous innovation going on by companies that are basically creating software to manage, analyze, aggregate data on behalf of companies. If I talk about a couple, we're investors in a company called Trendalytics, which basically sells to retailers. What they do is they aggregate a tremendous amount of consumer information online. So they use everything from Google searches, Facebook likes, Instagram feeds, Pinterest, all different ways consumers indicate demand on behalf of retailers and brands to enable them to be smarter about what products they sell in their stores. So if you're a big retailer and you're preparing for the next season and you want to understand what consumers are asking for in specific cities, locations, you can do that. You can use their software to do that. So it basically enables companies to reduce the amount of discounted inventory they have. And today, I think in retail, about 50% of apparel ends up being discounted because people don't really understand those consumer demands. You can never understand it perfectly, but you can improve. So those types of businesses that improve companies' operations are really popping up all over the place across different verticals. And I think you're seeing also wearable tech. People are familiar with things like Fitbit or those things that kind of monitor people's personal information, health information, which can be a positive, right? You can see how healthy you were a year ago and how many miles you ran, and Fitbit, great example. Right? Those kinds of things can benefit people's lives in a lot of different ways. So I'm fairly bullish on it. I think there are a lot of interesting technology applications that can help individuals and companies.
So you don't see a limitation based on the talk earlier, Moore's law kind of running out, and
I don't see an issue in terms of storage. I think if you look at storage, the ability of just how much data can be stored in a given server, that's increasing at a very, very rapid rate. I'm not so concerned with being able to store it. I think there will always be software that will be working to analyze it. I think the quantity of it will increase. It's just a matter of how big is the software. Really.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like Nnamdi, I mean, I'm really bullish on big data as well. I think that there are two things or two aspects that we really need to embrace. One is that much of the data that we have and that is out there is actually junk. And so from a business perspective, we've got to figure out how to clean that junk up out of our systems. For instance, just a small example. We had several months ago, we were doing a upgrade to a Oracle software product. And that product sat on 7 or 8 different servers. It took us, and we had to, in order to upgrade the product, we had to download all of the data off those 7 servers and then upload it back up, do the upgrade and then upload all the data up. But in the meantime, I told the guys, I said, look, you're downloading all this data, figure out what's trash, eliminate it, and just only upload the stuff that really has value. Because inside of a company, you've got old emails, you've got pictures from people's family reunions, you've got all kinds of stuff. I mean, everybody puts stuff on their company laptop or phone, and that stuff ends up in your data center. Well, it took us 7 hours to download all that data off of off those 7 servers. It took us 7 minutes to upload the data that really had value. 96.8% of all that data was trash. It was just trash. And so unlike in the old days when you didn't have all this cheap storage and people had paper records, right? Then you'd have file day, twice a year? Everybody go to work in their jeans and throw away old stuff. Well, you got to have file day in your companies with regard to data that is being stored that really has no value. And the other piece is that like with regard to big data, and why I think you should embrace it, is just the analytics. There are lots of companies and lots of software out there that is doing a great job now of analyzing big data and giving you good information that will help you drive cost out and efficiency in. I'm advising a small company that has a product, and the name of the company is Build Data Analytics, and this is a software as a service product that supports the construction industry. I found out in the last 6 or 8 months that 20% of every major construction project the cost is waste. Everybody's been to a big construction project where you got steel girders laying out there and have been out there for a couple of years, or old products and stuff just go well. Well, 20% of the cost of building of a large building, maybe $200, $300, $400 million, billion-dollar building, is waste. Well, this particular software as a service takes all that big data, all the information that is involved in building a large building, and it aggregates it, and it allows the builder to do things like not buy products or supplies that are no longer needed. Good example, this particular product is the actual carpenters or electricians would actually use this particular product. It's an app that would sit on a slate. The guy would go up to it, and let's say that you have a carpenter who's going to build 80 door frames. Well, the guy has his app, he hits the app on the slate, it shows him all the door frames that he's got to do and all the dimensions. All the door frames have to be 80 by 40. And so he does 10 of them, he gets to 11th one, and because of a beam that's in the way, he's got to make this one 75 by 35. Well, he puts that in the app, and that downloads that information all the way back through the process to supply chain. Now supply chain knows this door has to be 75 by 35 because the door frame is 75 by 35, and maybe the hinges are different. So they're not buying stuff that they don't need. Whereas right now, without that, they're just simply buying 80 doors all the same size. So there are a number of products and companies out there that are building services or a software that will take this big data, do the analytics for you, and give you output that really help you drive efficiency in and cost out. It's just incredible. I mean, again, just as Nnamdi, I would recommend people embrace it, but you got to clean it up, and you got to make sure that you're doing the analytics on things that are going to help drive your business forward.
Nnamdi, you want to talk a little bit about some of the venture companies that you guys have invested in and how that big data is playing a part in your investment strategy?
Yeah, two of them. I'd mention another called Refinity. Refinity is a software company in Boston that sells to big Fortune 1000 companies. What Refinity does is they enable companies to manage their real estate more effectively. So they have software which interfaces with a hardware device which can track building utilization and room utilization. So for a given office building, they can determine the number of people that came in and out in a given day. They can look in a particular office, how many people occupy that office in a given day, and they can aggregate it across buildings, across the enterprise. And the value they provide for big companies is they enable businesses to identify where they can reduce spend on real estate. So their first customer was Lenovo, which piloted them in 3 buildings. And Lenovo, after a period of months, basically said, wait a minute, some of these buildings are only 30% utilized. Nobody really is here. And we've got all these offices that are empty. We've got these remote workers. We've got a lot of space. We can either consolidate, we can sell, we can stop leasing. So that's really a value enhancement for them. It's really a way for companies to basically better understand. So the head of real estate really is the buyer. That's a good example of a business. And I think you're seeing it across different verticals. I would think about legal. I recall looking at a company called Recommind, which has a big data software platform to help companies do discovery. I'm sure there are some lawyers in the room here. So there you go. So the discovery process is, as you know, extremely tedious, right? You have associates churning through files, churning through emails, churning through millions of documents in some cases. What Recommind does is they have software that intelligently can search through data to identify the relevant documents. So they can reduce the amount of time spent on discovery by, multiples. And that's a business really that enhances the life of a legal counsel, per se, or the external counsel that is working on behalf of the corporation. So I think you're seeing those type of companies proliferate all over the place. And at the end of the day, they help companies either to reduce expenses or increase revenues at the end of the day.
Question from the audience? Right here.
Yeah, sure. So going back to what you were talking about in terms of data analytics, can you talk about what you see as the trends in terms of public perception when you start analyzing both structured and unstructured data? So structured data, just by way of example, would be like a survey data. So I voluntarily respond to a survey, you look at that data, versus going on my Instagram, my Facebook, my LinkedIn, and then figuring out, in these pictures I had a lot of makeup on, and so, then you try to market to me. So do you think the public is excited about this, or do you think there's concern, or how do you feel about it?
I think that it's mixed, but I think for the most part, most people get really concerned. And your point about unstructured data, most of us have a fair amount of control of the structured data we put out there. As you say, it's answering surveys. But what we don't have control over is how people take different parts, and go back to the young lady's point earlier, is they take different parts of information that's out there about us, and they put it together and they create profiles about who we are. Which goes back to the point earlier, is that you've got to actively manage what data is out there, even though that data, people can put different things together and come up with something very different than what you'd like for somebody to see or to think about you. That means you've got to be very careful and very deliberate about what you do put out there, and that you do want people to know. But it clearly makes us very nervous. I mean, I think the example we had this morning, when Nate was talking about, I think had the example where somebody called in to get something, and everybody knew, well, don't you want to get this pizza, because if you don't, you're going to gain weight, and your healthcare costs are going to go up, and so therefore I'm charging you $20 more. And I mean, that's pretty scary. I mean, that's a pretty scary. Yeah, and it is real. So I think most people are really afraid of it, but I think we're going to have to, but it's here, it's not going anywhere, and we've got to be very careful about and thoughtful about that information that actually goes out there. I mean, it's not going anywhere.
Yeah, those are good points, and I think we haven't yet addressed government, NSA and collection of that type of data, which is a whole different topic, but one that's very relevant. I think it's inevitable that the more information that's out there, that there's going to be concerns about how it's used. And I think, to Michael's point, think the only thing you do is be vigilant about what you're putting out there, who you're giving it to, who the providers are. I think if you look at the big social networks, I think Facebook and LinkedIn and all those companies really try to create the right policies around how they use the data and the fact that they anonymize it and they don't provide your information in terms of who you are to advertisers, but you're kind of dependent upon them to be consistent in that.
Are there any particular areas of big data that have not quite, particularly around big data analytics, that have not made it to kind of the mainstream conversation that you think are interesting?
Yeah.
I think that the Internet of Things concept is something that's very interesting. And Internet of Things really is, at the end of the day, having smart sensors and smart devices that over time can kind of be optimized based upon your personal preferences. I think one good example of that is a company called Nest, which was acquired by Google, I think for $3 billion, I believe, last year. What Nest, their first product was a smart thermostat, which basically adjusted based upon an individual's historical patterns as to what temperature that they like. And there's a lot more than that, but that was their first product. I think you're seeing a lot of companies starting to invest in this Internet of Things idea. We were just talking about, I think at lunch, Tesla. You said you had a Tesla car, and you can talk about it. But I was amazed by how intelligent it was in terms of. Why don't you talk about it?
Well, I mean, to your point about using aggregating data, or the analytics, it's driving. I mean, for instance, driving habits, those kind of things. Cisco calls it the Internet of Everything, and that I think Ron may have said the other day that there's only 10% of the items that could be on the internet are on the internet now, and that's growing exponentially every year. So, I mean, it's only 10%. That's just amazing, isn't it? I mean, cars are not on the internet. Mine is. And all those other Tesla people out there who have them. And we charge up for free. I could care less how much gas costs. Yes, I do own Tesla stock. No, I don't. Not really. I really don't, honey. I really don't. But I think that as you start looking at how this stuff is growing, and I mean, there's so many things that aren't being analyzed that you're going to need to over the course of time. There is a huge space out there, and Nnamdi's investing in it, for companies that do analytics on big data. I mean, it's just an incredible space out there. Because if you think, only 10% of everything that could be on the internet is, and how that's growing over time. I mean, it's just a huge space, and lots and lots of things.
Yeah, one of the things that has happened historically as we have big shifts in terms of employment spaces is that we as African Americans are not prepared to jump in at the forefront. We're playing catch up. So my question is, how would you advise, let's say sort of the millennials and younger folks who want to play in this space, what kinds of experiences should they be getting, both in the workplace, outside the workplace, to sort of position themselves to play if this is really where the career advancement, or one of the career advancement vehicles?
I think that's a very important point. There are a couple statistics that I was reading yesterday that are very relevant to this discussion. I think Gartner, which is a technology consulting firm, projected that over the next 10 years, I believe, 4.5 million jobs will be created as a result of big data. Importantly, each IT job will generate 3 more non-IT positions at some of these companies. So there's a big onus to improve skills to be prepared for that, and I think it can come into a couple different forms. If you're interacting directly with the data, there's a position called data scientist that a lot of companies are hiring for now. That's a technical position. It's basically data analysis. That's a job that I think will continually be important within enterprises. Security we talked about before. And there are different levels of knowledge. You could be a programmer, somebody who understands the code, somebody who's designing software on behalf of a business. You could be an IT consultant, enabling companies to understand the business issues around managing data. It could be everything from just managing business operations, creating the right compliance protocols. There are legal issues there. So I think there are a bunch of different aspects to it. I mean, one is just getting smart about what's happening, getting smart about which companies are going to be at the forefront, getting smart about what roles are being created. There are a lot of different ways to do it. MBAs, for example, if you go to business school, increasingly now managing IT operations is something that's critical. I remember when I went to business school, that was 7 years ago, a big part of our learning was how to manage technology teams and technology operations. So increasingly, I think across all different elements of the of companies, knowledge of what's going on in terms of data is going to be important.
I also think too that while focusing on technology education is really important, also focusing on very basic mathematical education is really important. I'm advising a company now that's in the that's in another space other than the construction space, where the folks that came up with these ideas about new software are mathematicians. The technology is going to change, but the math behind it is what's consistent. And math grows too over time. But so some of it is new thought process, but the math behind it, ends up being consistent throughout. So I mean, for instance, one of the products at this particular company, and it's called Dan Solutions, that we're looking at, and it's been patented for about 1.5 years, and we can't quite get there in terms of getting it into the marketplace, primarily because it cannibalizes some other analytical businesses. But what it does is that it is called relational recognition. So right now, when you take a picture that is digital, that everything in that picture has a series of zeros and ones behind it, right? Well, what you see, that the image that is there is what you and I would just see as we take the picture. Well, there's a lot more data on that picture than just what you see. For instance, there's a different set of zeros and ones for the pores in your skin than it is for the flat spots on your skin. There's a different set of zeros and ones for a bag of powder, baby powder, than there is for a bag of cocaine. So imagine being able to take that relational recognition software and have it on a sensor going through a TSA machine. And so when that TSA guy sees this bag of white powder, or with the post office, when we see a envelope full of white powder, that this relational recognition software will tell you, once you run it through a knowledge database, whether it's baby powder or whether it's anthrax. And you don't have to have a human being make that determination for you. I mean, there are all kinds of things that are happening that if you've got a real solid basic mathematical background, that you can jump in and play. Because the technology is going to change the application of the technology is going to change over time. There hadn't been a whole lot of new technology out there in the last 10 years, the truth be told. It's just a function of improving it and applying it to ways that haven't been thought of before.
Any other questions? Okay, we're gonna let you dominate.
But I'm wondering, there's a big debate over who owns your data. And certainly in the medical industry, I think they've got some tentative solutions coming along at least. I'm wondering, in the general area of big data, how is that going? Are the corporate interests so strong that forget it, they're going to force you to give up everything?
Well, it depends on the company. It depends on the terms of use. Frequently, as an individual, if you're talking about social networks or the information you put out there, e-commerce, for example, your information is owned by the companies. At least your transaction history, they store, address information, credit card information. Now, there's limits in terms of how they can use it. There's limits in terms of what it can be used for. There are often limits in terms of who it can be marketed to. Usually those limits are fairly strict, but at the same time, that data oftentimes is owned by the companies. And if you're talking about businesses, the same idea applies. If you're a company working with an external vendor, you want to think about what information are you giving them and what are they using it for, and if you're creating IP, who owns it. Those issues are often very thorny issues that you really need to think through. So I think there will always be debate about that. I think debate both in terms of ownership, but also in terms of use. And I think whether it's an individual or a company, you always want to think about the use. What are the limits? What are the restrictions? You know, how long is that data stored for? If you bought from a company and you decide to leave, what happens to that data at that point? If you no longer transact with them, do they still remember you? Do they still store that information? Do you get marketed to? So those are a lot of the issues. I think there'll continue to be issues that people discuss and debate about.
There is just a real short addition to that, and I agree with everything. But if you're doing business with the federal government, there is a whole set of rules around who owns the data. And in general, the federal government does not want to own data that has commercial value if it is not necessary for defense or not required to be. So there's a whole set of rules around that if you're doing business with the federal government. State and local governments, I'm not so sure. But the feds are very, very clear about like who owns what data and when.
Well, I can just say that state governments, on the most part, they think they own their data, and they don't want to hear anything from anybody else. Any other questions? Back in the back?
Forgive me, I'm sorry. I'm here trying to get a room at this hotel, but I'm crashing your meeting here.
All right.
But it's been very interesting to me because I'm here with a number of congressional leaders from the Black Caucus, and it's amazing how this conversation is intertwining with the conversation that they're having in terms of laws and regulations as to who really does own the stuff that's in the cloud, who is responsible for the release of it. One of the gentlemen had made a statement that he felt that the crown jewels should be kept in-house. Could you expound on that a little bit more in terms of how you separate? The lady had brought up the question of aggregating. Once you put it out there, anybody can go get it. So how do you separate that information that you were talking about?
Yeah, there are software products that can set on either individual devices or products that whether you're computing virtually or not, there are products that will allow the creator of that data to determine whether or not it's a crown jewel, so to speak, just to coin that term, whether or not that data goes into the crown jewels bucket or it does not. Once it gets out to, gets over to, I hate to say out because it makes it seem like the cloud is out there, but once it gets to a third-party provider of a data storage service, then at some level you really don't have but so much control other than the control that is put on that particular bit of data when it actually gets there. So if you're in a private cloud environment, you have a lot more control over it than if you're in a multi-tenant cloud environment. But for the most part, the specific answer is there are software products that will allow the creator of that data to say, yep, this is a crown jewel, press a button and it goes that way, or no, it's not, and it goes the other way. But once it gets out there, it's kind of hard to pull it back. But that's why virtual computing, I think, is a direction that every organization really need to go in, so that you don't have data, sitting on your individual device.
Well, one of the biggest problems that have being questioned in Congress right now, because it's a new industry and the cloud is new, how do you regulate information and who is responsible and liable for that information once it hits the cloud? I'm sure you guys have seen there have been a number of regulations coming in terms of hackers, the punitive damages and the punishable damages. But how do you regulate something that is so arrogant or is so much out there that you can't control who is responsible and liable as to information, especially private information on your Facebook, that type of thing? People can go on and change that information. And they're really wrestling right now with how to set those regulations. So are you suggesting that that type of information, you should keep it in-house? So therefore you have went back to the situation of having your own server, that type of thing?
Yeah, what I'm suggesting is that if the information, one, you need to determine what information is really that important to you. I'm calling it crown jewels. But if it's really that important to you, and for the most part, it shouldn't be a lot for most entities. If it's really that important to you, then you ought to keep it inside. If it's not that important to you, in terms of it being a real crown jewel, and you decide to put it to or give it to a third party, to the cloud, to manage for you, then at least right now it becomes an individual contract relationship. I don't know any provider out there, Amazon or anybody else, that will take the responsibility and accept liability for the inadvertent release of that information and any damage that it may do to a particular company. Now, you may have a different experience, but most people, Amazon, Microsoft, nobody's going to accept the liability for their mistake of releasing information to the outside of that service. If it causes any kind of damage anywhere. So maybe Congress does need to step in and to create some regulations around who's liable for what in that situation. But currently, it's just a matter of the contract between the cloud provider and the user, the individual company or person.
I think that's right. I think in terms of laws, there will continue to be new statutes created to address issues of consumer privacy. I think that's very important in terms of making sure that companies are kind of held to account for making sure that data is stored in the right way, that it's anonymized, that they have certain rules around where it's stored and how it's stored. So, I think rules can help in terms of kind of keeping companies to account. If you're a business, you have to think about your own operations and making sure you're complying with those rules as well as your own policies and setting the right policies and having the right people in place. I think that's the best you can really do.
You guys talked about the consumers and our use of social media, or for that matter, our buying habits and credit card usage. Could you, in a general sense, explain what happens and who is liable, like in the case of Target? Does the consumer have an avenue for recovery if they are harmed by a breach of security by something like happening at Target? Or are we completely at the mercy of the Targets of the world?
Yeah, so there are a couple different ways to address that. If say you're a consumer and you bought from Target and your bank account information or your credit card information was compromised, right? And somebody took that information and bought product that you didn't approve of, I think you'd first go to the credit card company and say, look, somebody bought that wasn't me, and what's your policy in terms of refunding me for that? If it's directly to Target, and I don't know exactly what happened there in terms of litigation, but I assume there may have been a class action proposed there by a group of consumers on behalf of the class of people that were impacted by the data breach. I think companies in the past, I believe, have probably settled those types of lawsuits if there was harm done to individuals. I don't know that particular case, kind of what the fallout was, but I think definitely as a consumer of a Target, making sure that your voice is heard and making sure that their policies changed and they're public about their policies. And I think they actually were, post that happening, fairly proactive in trying to address the issue, but I don't know the specifics. But I think there are different avenues you can approach as an individual, and there are different approaches you can take, whether it's directly with Target, whether it's with your credit card provider or your bank. It really depends exactly what happened. You may have more information about the Target example.
Follow up. So all of us go online and we sign up to utilize some service, and there's this long disclaimer. Read this if you agree. But nobody, I shouldn't say nobody. Maybe somebody here reads all of this. I tried once and I gave up. So it's like I agree because I want to use it. What did I agree to? I don't know. What did I agree to?
Yeah, I practiced law for a long time, but we have one or two or three other lawyers in the house. My guess is that's a function of a state law, and it would vary state to state. I don't know of any federal legislation that actually addresses that. One of the things you may want to think about doing, which what I do a lot, is I use cash instead of going to use my credit card. Not online, huh? But you end up agreeing to basically end up in most cases you end up agreeing not to sue Target if for some reason or other your information ends up being released inadvertently. And so but there are lots and lots and lots of good software products out there that are keeping things secure. And so I wouldn't, I'm not sure I would recommend stop buying stuff online. But on the other hand, you need to be aware of the fact that there are possibilities out there, and people ought to check their accounts pretty regular and make sure that there's nothing happening. I mean, I've had 3 occasions where my identity has been stolen. I had one occasion where somebody took, I don't know, $1,200 out of my checking account, and they were in Denver, and they did it 30 minutes after I took a couple $100 out in DC. And so the bank was very quick with regard to being able to stop any additional transactions because the software figured out that how could I possibly take something out So there's a lot of stuff out there, and there are rules, and in general, most of the larger banks have policies where they will put your money back within a certain time period, that kind of stuff. So, but you really have to be vigilant. I mean, we're online and we live there, all of us do, and you got to be vigilant about checking it and being proactive there. So.
Okay. Any more questions? Last one. Final question. Yes, no, maybe? Good. We want to thank Nnamdi Okike and Michael Bennett for enlightening us on this very significant topic of big data. We hope that you have enjoyed their presentation, and we hope that it has been beneficial for you as you go forward in your professional lives. And now I want to turn it back over to Greg Devins.